everyone, welcome back to another reInvent episode on this channel. As before, we've wanted to record our sessions that aren't recorded at reInvent so you could enjoy them at home. So you'll be checking out this session, COP-205, with me and Arthur. So let's get into it. You're here today to learn about forecasting. This is because you want to stay on track. You don't want to go over budget, and you want to make sure you keep your execs happy. Forecasting in the cloud can seem tricky as we've moved from this static on-premise model where we knew exactly what we were paying for each month to the cloud, which is more flexible, which is more cost-effective, but harder to predict. In this case, it can often feel like you're trying to see the future. And when I think of that, I often think of a magic 8 ball. If you don't know, the magic 8 ball was invented in the 1940s for fortune telling. And I think it's a good analogy of what you might be feeling in this forecasting dilemma. You might be asking, how much am I going to spend next month? Do I know what I'm going to spend next month? Ask again later. Not very helpful. So what we wanted to do was ensure that when you leave this session and when you've watched this video, that you come away with a plan of how to forecast so you could be a bit more equipped to predict the future. So on to the serious stuff. What are we going to do in this video? We're going to cover 3 main points. The first is what causes spend change. The second, what are types of forecasting? And the third, what are the key considerations for forecasting? And that will be our presentation. And in reInvent, we'll be doing a short talk. But for you guys, we'll be having a discussion, Arthur and I, about different types of forecasting. So just to introduce myself, you guys probably know me on the channel, but my name is Steph and I'm a Senior Optimization Architect at AWS. Arthur?
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Arthur and I'm a Customer Solution Manager here at AWS.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Arthur, for doing this with me. I'm excited for everyone to see our talk today. So we're going to go into a small section, which is going to be a bit of a brainstorm section, which is we wanted to think about what causes bills to change. So these could be planned or unplanned things. For example, a planned one would be a business driver of a new product release. So what we would normally do is ask people about this, but we've already got some pre-made examples for you guys. So Arthur, are there any of these that jump out at you when you think about what causes bills to change, that when you speak to customers, they kind of notice or think about?
Oh, definitely migrations. Because it's a funny thing, because as a customer, you're kind of expecting your bill to change, but you don't know exactly how much that's going to happen. So definitely migration is a big driver there.
Nice. I always find optimizations, I think, is confusing for people. So suddenly their bill's gone down, which is sometimes a good thing, but they're not, if that kind of cooperation or collaboration hasn't happened between different business units, suddenly you're like, why are you massively over budget or under budget? And it's kind of confusing. So always that. And I guess following on from that, trying new things, the amount of times people try a random instance type or a random new service and suddenly get a surprising bill.
A different region as well, right? Sometimes you have different teams trying different applications, and that may happen, that may caught you out of guard as well.
Oh goodness, yeah. I feel like I remember back in the day when I would be trying stuff in kind of sandbox accounts and I would have different regions to play around in, and I would use different regions as like a fresh start and then probably forget to delete them, but I don't work there anymore, so it's fine. Also, okay, so we really wanted to highlight some of these things so that if you are trying to forecast, if your forecast is wrong, then you have some areas to look into with your teams that you can work backwards from, especially with your developers. So some people who might have seen some of these videos before or been to a talk might recognize my engineer picture. So a quick tip from this is, if your forecast is off, check with the people who built it. They're the people that made the workloads in the clouds, and they should know what is going on and what is probably going to go on in the future, what's going on in the next sprint or the next migration, as Arthur said. So make sure that you speak with engineers to get your forecast more accurate. You can also speak to your account teams. They are very handy when it comes to forecasting. So if you haven't spoken to them about it, make sure you do. Okay, so we know about why forecasting might change. So let's move on to what are some types of forecasting and how to actually forecast. So I'm going to pass over to Arthur, who has these conversations all the time with customers, to explain the different types of forecasting. Over to you, Arthur.
Thanks, Steph. Good forecasting drives better business decisions. However, The goal is not to predict our cloud costs just for the sake of it, but instead to tell us as an organization what we need to know in order to make meaningful decisions in the present. Cloud is a variable operating expense that requires more dynamic approach when it comes to forecasting. So let's start by understanding what we're trying to predict first. Pardon me for the simplification, but there are only two types of workloads we want to forecast in the cloud. First, we have existing workloads, applications that are already hosted in the cloud. They're easy to predict because there are prior information available about their utilization and how much they cost. It doesn't mean they're static though. There are plenty of elastic workloads, in the cloud that will scale up and down according to the demand. Second, we have new workloads, like an upcoming migration or a new product that's going to be launched in the cloud. These depends on more variables, so they're a little bit more complex to predict. For example, what is going to be launched, when this is going to happen, and how certain we are about the previous answers. Things can change, and that's good, mostly because it means that your organization is trying to adjust its original plan to meet your business goals. And a good cloud forecast will take into consideration how these changes will impact cloud spend. Today, we will cover two types of forecasts. First is the trend-based forecasting. Trend-based forecasting uses historical spend to estimate your future bill. It assumes that the same level of growth will continue. It's often used by companies who are in a steady business state, and it's a common first step for customers who are starting to implement cost estimation mechanisms. There is a limitation though. It does not take into consideration external factors and new business demands, since these aren't reflected in the historical spend data. The second type of forecast is drive-based forecasting. Driver-based forecasting factors in business demand to estimate future cloud costs. It's often used by companies who are preparing to launch a new product or planning a flash sale event. This is what the business think it's going to happen. It's also a good approach to forecast costs during cloud migrations. So instead of a business demand, you are factoring in an upcoming migration or migration waves. There is a dependency on this model though. For this to work, it requires a strong collaboration between the business, the technology, and the finance teams. And a lot of customers ask us about tooling or what kind of tooling should we use to estimate costs. So I normally recommend them to start with AWS Cost Explorer, our native cost management solution. Cost Explorer can report the last 14 months of cost and usage. And more recently, it allowed customers to get up to 38 months of historical data. Based on the past usage, AWS Cost Explorer can calculate the forecast for up to the next 12 months with an 80% prediction interval accuracy. What that means is, whatever the number is, there is an 80% chance that that number will fall within the predicted range. It's important to highlight, though, that the higher the prediction interval is, so the longer you go, the wider the prediction range will be. It's convenient, it's free, and allow your company to slice the data by service, by account, by teams. So I think it's a great way to start. So let's put all this together. Combining trend and driver-based forecasting is the best practice we observe with customers that present advanced FinOps practice within the organization. If you're starting to promote more collaboration and more cost awareness activities, this is a great activity to start leaning in, because this is an ongoing effort to review and improve, as any forecast should be. So every cycle, when your team sits to review the projected numbers and discuss why they're over or under, that is a learning opportunity to get better and understand the root causes of what's driving your cloud costs. It's unlikely that you reach an 100% accuracy, and that's fine. What you want to is aim to get as close as your business requirements tells you to do. As I said in the beginning, good forecasting drives better business decisions. And I'm sure a lot of the people here in the audience are involved in business planning conversations for the next year. So it's important to understand the difference between forecasting and budget. Forecasts will tell us where you think you're going, and budget what you have been allocated. So a strong forecast should be able to influence budget planning and future cloud investments decisions. So let me now hand it back to Steph, who share a forecast example with you guys.
Thanks, Arthur. And I think the point about combining the two is very, very important. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. All right. So let's go into this example forecast. So I want to take a moment to summarize what we have learned and go through an example forecast. So for this example, we're going to be looking at a trend-based forecast. So I'm looking at my historical spend over the last couple of months. And by using that data, I can work out that there's been a 15% increase approximately in my spend. So the first thing I've done is I've worked out what my percentage change has been month over month. Now I have that, I need to think about what caused this spend change. Why will be growing at 15%? So I go and I figure out, I already know that is a migration. Like Arthur said, that's a spend, that's a driver. Take that into consideration. And what do I need to do now? Who do I need to ask to see if this is still going on? You're saying it at home? We need to check with those engineers, check with the builders, ask the questions. Is this still continuing? Have we got more to migrate? Are we done? Is the migration going to continue at this rate, or are you going to speed up? The engineers should know this. They're going to have sprints planned for the next couple of weeks. And so you can use that information to assess what next. So in this situation, I've asked them, they've said, yeah, Steph, don't worry, we're still going to keep building at the same rate. And so now I can calculate what my forecast is going to be, which is just going to be a 15% increase at the next month. Now I know that's a very basic method, but I wanted you to watch this video and at least have a method that you could get started with. But we do know there are more elements to a forecast, some of which we mentioned earlier. So I'm actually going to go through the last part of the presentation, which is the key considerations for a forecast. We're going to go through 5 key elements to consider when forecasting. The first, audience. Who is this forecast for? Is it for devs? Is it for finance? Is it for business? This will affect your forecast, especially the format it's going to be in. Next, we have the frequency. Is this a once a year big forecast that you need to get right, but it can have a lot of leeway? Or is it a monthly check-in that you can iterate on over and over again and improve what the data is? This is really important for not only that kind of methodology around it, but also the process in which you're creating the forecast. If it's monthly, don't make that a manual process. Automate that as much as possible using tools like Cost Explorer. Next, we have granularity. Is it your entire AWS organization or is it one tag? That's a decision you have to make and will change the accuracy of your forecast. Speaking of accuracy, how much do you care if it's accurate? Or how will it affect the rest of your planning and business? I would always recommend allowing for a larger accuracy kind of variation while you get started, but try and hone it in. And finally, actions. What do you want to happen after you see this forecast? This is very important, as if you don't know this, what's the point? So we're actually going to use these bits in our Chalk Talk at reInvent and see how they relate to different people's business. And so what we're actually going to be doing is a whiteboard time where we'll be looking at different key considerations that we have for different audiences. So we're going to do a version of this. Don't worry, we're going to do a version of this on here so you can see what we come up with, but we're just going to have a discussion in it. But the key focus is, what do we need to consider when forecasting for different audiences? And that is because when Arthur and I were discussing these different characteristics, these different elements, we realized that the audience played a massive part in the rest of the elements. And so we're going to look at this kind of finance business element to it versus a developer. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pop up on the screen the version that we have summarized, in which you can look at and screenshot or have this video. But Arthur, should we just like wander through the 5 elements and kind of discuss them a little bit? So in terms of audience, maybe as a question, when you speak to people at ABCs and kind of high level people, when you start doing forecasting, who are they mainly for, do you think?
It's a funny question because normally when I ask that same question to customers, very few of them actually have a specific audience in mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of these problems that you're trying to go to the root of it and try to fix it without really knowing first who the audience is. But I would recommend first start with a business audience, because again, we're trying to use the data to make business decisions. So they will be, I think, initially the main audience for this type of work. But of course, there are plenty of cases where you want the technical team to be able to have to view and participate on the discussion as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I hear about forecasting for customers the most, it's often for execs in the business so they can plan, especially because I know that people have like financial planning situations. I've never had to, I'm somewhat fortunate, I've never had to do it. So I haven't had to deal with that. But it's really important that those people can see the numbers and at least kind of get an estimate of it. I guess that kind of brings us well on to frequency. So for that, I assume a lot of the time you need kind of a big year forecast. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah, they do together with the budget planning. Normally, there's a lot of yearly planning happening, but there is on the frequency piece. There are two elements, right, Steph? There is how far you want to forecast, but also how frequent you want to check the numbers that you forecast. So normally you're forecasting for a year or so, but you're checking that, from my observations, normally on a monthly basis. Of course, depending on the business of the customer, they might want to do this more often or even less often, right? Depending on how big the finance team is, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I've also seen people who have wanted to do it weekly, who I think are the people who it's often the devs who want that, and they're the ones who have a lot of control on the data. And so they just want to see how things are affecting. And it's because everything's probably pre-propagated on a dashboard for them. And so they can track that metric very easily. And it's not like a manual effort for them to go and get it. It's just there in front of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I also think that,
Yeah.
as I mentioned before, I think this is, if the people who are listening to us, they're starting to build, cost awareness activities within the organization. I think forecasting is just a great one to start leading in. If you have, different people with different backgrounds, technical and finance people mostly, as they meet on a monthly basis to discuss this, I just think it's such a rich experience. It allows finance to understand how variable and sometimes challenge cloud spending can be, and also for the technical teams understand why finance needs that information, and how accurate they need, how frequent. So it's a great way to start that.
Yeah, definitely that idea of having everyone in a room discussing it and clarifying really opens up those lines of dialogue, which is really important. So in terms of granularity, when I was talking to you about forecasting when we first started doing this presentation, I was speaking to one of my teammates as well. I felt it was quite overwhelming forecasting, because if I look at my especially one of my large customers, or if I look at maybe where I used to work and would have to forecast for them, it would be so many things. And then we started talking about granularity and how you could focus on maybe a service that was a bigger business, or like the biggest driver in the spend, or a tag or an account, made it seem so much more manageable. So do you often suggest people should start off with a more focused approach on what thing to focus on their forecasting for?
So working for Amazon, we tend to work backwards from customers, right? So I normally answer that question with, okay, who is your audience? If we're talking more about executives or finance people, from my observation, most of the times they will not necessarily care about forecasting EC2 or EMR, or they will care about business units or specific products. And maybe not all of them, like maybe there are a couple, they're very important for them that they wanted to focus on. So I'll normally start there from a granularity perspectives, right? And then depending on how advanced the customer is, let's say it's a company who is tracking cost per transaction, and that's very critical for them. So yeah, with the upcoming changes you're planning on that architecture, what are the forecast cost per transaction you're thinking? So I'm talking about the unit metrics here, of course. So depending on how used the organization is with these metrics, that's also a good granularity too. But the rule of thumb is really, as you report this data, will your audience understand, or do you have follow-up questions like, what is this, what is that? If they have, you probably wanted to rethink the granularity.
Yeah, and if you're watching this and thinking like, oh, I need to, maybe you don't need to, maybe you want to have a go at forecasting, that's probably a better situation to be in, that you want to rather than you need to. I would be really interested to have a look at your account and see what your biggest spend driver is, if it's EC2 or if it's RDS or ECS or something like that, or even a random service like CloudWatch, and then try and forecast that one out as just a challenge to yourself and see if you get it right. And then you can always grow that logic. And I think it becomes more better, like with experience and things like that. Speaking of this kind of growing it out, accuracy. Now, obviously, there's loads of different ways. I actually had someone tell me they were 1% accurate, which was a 1% variant. Is that the right word? Which is phenomenal. But if people want to get more accurate with their forecast, what do you often recommend them to do, or what tools to use and things like that?
So I think first of all, it's important from my observations, customers who are spending not a lot of time, but they're, let's say, a little bit, that I consider to be a little bit more advanced in forecasting,
Mm-hmm.
they're getting close to 10%, a little, giving more and take on accuracy per month, which I think is a pretty good number. Like for the exercise you just recommended people to do it, I think they would be surprised like how accurate they can be with the native tools we have, like Cost Explorer.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms to improving the accuracy, of course, it depends. If your initial number is like 40% off, that's where you need to understand, okay, what happened that I missed, do some
Yeah.
root cause analysis with, again, so important to have both technical and finance teams involved here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a big variation like that, most likely you missed a migration or missed like a big product
Yeah.
launch that was happening. It's normally something that is new. It's a new workload. Very rarely is an existing workload, right? Um, but if you're already on that 10% threshold, if you're trying to improve that, then we need to get into things like very deep elements. You need to almost like isolate some of the bill. So if you have a X%, $1 million bill or something, you need to see what part of that bill is actually falling close to your forecast and
Mm-hmm.
which one is being more peaky. So you need to start slicing the problem, isolating the problem a little bit, and see maybe it's not the whole bill that it's being varying, but it's just a small piece of it, and then see how you can work with that team to see how you can improve the accuracy there.
Yeah. And that perfectly lines up with this last bit, which is actions. So I think this is also really interesting because there are just that question of what happens with the forecast. Like if it's perfectly accurate, if you nailed it, I guess, what do you do then? Or also, I think it's more dramatic if you very much over forecast or under forecast, right? So, and like that bit we did at the start, which was what caused your bill to change, figuring out if it's wrong, going and looking at those things and figuring out what happened and then adjusting based on it. But asking questions like, who do you need to let know if the forecast is off? Do you need to, if you're working in finance, maybe you need to go and speak to all those different people and figure out what happened. But do you need to inform the business that, oh my God, we forecast massively off, we spent way more money, I need to go and tell somebody senior? Or is it or even in a better situation, maybe you massively over forecast and you're like, oh wow, we've got all this money to play with. Can you spend it on something else? Can you realign the budgets to give somebody else more room to use more technology or newer licenses or whatever's relevant to your business? Or does it just go back into the pocket and everybody else can use it? Do you suggest any kind of actions when speaking to customers or see any that they've started to implement?
Yeah, so definitely talk to the business, definitely talk to the audience you're providing this forecast why you're off. I think it's important to not only provide the numbers, but have an explanation why you're over or under. And to your point, yeah, if you're over, normally you need to, normally for the cases that I see, it's either you missed the size, like for a migration, for example,
Mm-hmm.
you're too overconfident on the size of the boxes, and as you launch them, you realize you needed bigger boxes. So
Mm-hmm.
come up with an explanation. I think kind of outside of the forecasting topic, but you need to find, as you have your FinOps team leading this, you need to find a way to communicate these changes that sometimes are technical changes to a non-technical audience, right? So explaining that Graviton didn't perform, you need to find a way to make this more digestible for your audience, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely have an explanation. For the under forecast, that's an interesting one because you're right. Maybe we were too optimistic. Sorry, we were too conservative. We have more money now to reinvest or something or to save. But sometimes what happens is something that is supposed to happen this month didn't. So it's almost like it didn't happen this month, but will happen the next one. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why you need to dive a little deeper to understand what is causing these variations, because sometimes you don't want to go this month to the business and say, hey, we save 20% of the cost that we're projecting, and then next month you will over 30%, right? So you
Yeah.
need to be able to balance this communication, keep it like a regular journey.
Yeah, that's interesting as well, because I've had customers recently who've said, you can't see how much we've saved, because as soon as they delete something, like deleting out of resources, they're also migrating, and it ends up just leveling out. So I wonder how it's interesting, all the different elements of that. Okay, so that is end of our kind of discussion section. And from this, what we want you to do at home is decide kind of your priorities, your data sets, your scope. And when you watch this, you'll probably be at home or in the office, but choose something from each of these different columns and use that as your foundation. Choose your audience. Who is that priority you're focusing on? When do you want to start this forecasting? Hopefully as soon as possible. What is the scope that you want to start with? Maybe start small, like I suggested, and figure out what tools, and most importantly, as I said, what will happen once you've got this forecast in front of you. So just on to a little wrap up, our call to action: check out Cost Explorer, look at what you've been spending money on, if it's your account or your entire organization. Get a picture of what is going on, speak to different people, speak to finance, speak to devs, make sure you understand what is going on holistically. And don't get analysis paralysis. Have a go. I think it's just a simple thing. Go make a guess. It could be a finger in the air, or it could be an exact Excel calculation, but have a go. And funny, closing with my magic 8 board, did I forget anything else? Yes, you did. Oh yeah, here are some forecasting links. So we put together this link tree, which has a bunch of useful videos, blogs, resources that you should check out if you are getting started with forecasting. And you probably know this if you're on my channel already, but we have our weekly Twitch show on AWS Twitch, twitch.tv/AWS, where you can check out conversations like the one that me and Arthur are having right now. So go and subscribe there, and subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for listening to us. If you have any questions or follow-ups, feel free to drop us an email. And that is it for our reInvent session.